If it matters to you, it matters to us. Call Tip today on 1-800-938-007.
Now, we were speaking with Leanne earlier on, and we were speaking about the development of the wooden toilet seat in Anina. Well, delighted to hear from a gentleman who says, delighted to hear you talk about my brother Paddy Corbett of Coolbawn and about his toilet seats. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2014. Isn't that very sad news? And we'd love to find out more about that, because a lot of people are intrigued by that piece this morning. But thank you very much indeed for getting in touch with us on 1800 938 007. Now it's time to continue on with our series, The History of Ireland, with John G. O'Dwyer. Good morning to you, John.
Good morning, Fran.
Good to see you today. Ireland, the 17th century, and I mean a period of enormous change over that 100 years.
Absolutely, enormous change. There's no doubt about that. What you had then is the last time we stopped with a defeat of the Irish and the Spanish at the Battle of Kinsale.
Yes.
So at that stage then, O'Neill and O'Donnell returned forlornly to Ulster. Now, what would happen then? Mountjoy, who was the Lord Deputy in Ireland, you would generally expect then he would attack their territory, which he did. He laid waste to Ulster and he caused a famine. But now, in the meantime, then, there was still a huge army in Ireland, and Queen Elizabeth wasn't too happy with that. Goodness, the expenditure of keeping this, she wanted peace. And she was afraid that O'Neill and O'Donnell would fight a guerrilla war in Ulster and keep a huge army tied down, which she couldn't afford. She was almost at the end of her life then. She wanted out, and she ordered Mountjoy to negotiate. And so you got the Treaty of Mellifont. Extraordinarily, a pardon for O'Neill and O'Donnell. They were allowed to keep on their Catholic faith. They were allowed to keep their lands, the titles Earls of Tyrone, but they had to submit to the English crown. They had to use the English language and English law. It seemed a very good treaty for them.
Where did that go wrong? Because they ended up
that's
leaving the country.
It's all about to go wrong, and this is one of the things. Communication isn't great in the 17th century. So, you know, the Queen is over there, and then King James, they might have their ideas, but what were the people on the ground? And the new deputy in Ireland, Governor of Ireland for the British, was a fellow called Arthur Chichester, and he disliked O'Neill and O'Donnell immensely. So even though the Queen might think one thing, he kept harassing them, inciting local lords against them. It was becoming very, very difficult for them. But then what happened? Have you heard about it? The gunpowder plot.
No.
Oh, Guy Fawkes.
Oh, Guy Fawkes, yeah,
yes,
sure,
exactly.
yes.
That's the gunpowder plot. He's still over there. He still gets put on top of
Indeed,
a bonfire and burned. But this was it. This was a Catholic plot to destroy the English Parliament. And the idea was that there were cellars in the Parliament, they'd fill it with gunpowder, and when the King and all the MPs were opening Parliament, everybody would be there, you'd blow the whole thing up. It was all found out about that. It didn't go ahead, but what happened was then, of course, there was a big clampdown. This happens periodically. There's a hysteria against Catholics. And this is making things more difficult for O'Neill. Then King James sends him a summons to come to London, and he smells a rat. He might end up in the Tower. And it's at that stage he decides to leave Ireland. The flight of the Earls in 1607, and that brought an end then to the Gaelic way of life, the most Gaelic part of Ireland. That was lost, mid and west Ulster. Right. They were gone, and now you had the plantations.
And that made room for the plantation, didn't it, at that
Absolutely.
point?
Well, it kind of did. What happened then was Chichester seized all their lands. He seized the land of the Catholics. But what he wanted to do was throw out the Catholics and bring in Protestant settlers. But the problem was there wasn't that many English Protestants who were interested in coming in and coming into war-torn Ulster. Same thing as with the Munster plantation, couldn't get enough. And then they had an idea, what about Presbyterians? Now, Presbyterians didn't recognise the king as the supreme head of the church, but they recognised him as the temporal ruler. They were also Protestant, generally fairly loyal and English speaking. So not ideal, but this will be good enough. So
and were they largely Scottish?
they were largely Scottish.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
it. Presbyterianism was a religion that developed mainly in Scotland. They were mainly Scottish, but they were from areas of Scotland that was along the border. The border reivers, they're still called. And they came in there, and that was already a war-torn area. For them, it was out of the frying pan and into the fire. They were poorer. They were happy enough to get land. But the Protestants, the English Protestants, weren't as inclined to come in. Another thing that's happening now at this stage is Virginia is opening up. Virginia in America as a colony.
Yeah,
James
yeah.
is opening up that. Much more opportunities, cheaper land, less war-torn there. If you could get a passage to America, it was much better to go there. So the plantations, they still didn't get enough. And the result was, even though all the Catholics were to be driven out, they never were. To cut the corn and get in the harvest, you needed them. And so the undertakers very quietly kept the Catholics on. So the plantation of Ulster was only a partial success, but of course has left us problems to this day.
I never thought about the American option
Yeah.
in parallel with this, if you know what I mean.
At the same time.
At the same time, yeah.
Yeah, it's James. This is where you get...
It's James the First.
James the First.
Yes.
So you get Jamestown still in Virginia in America, the very first colony over there called after James. So all that big expansion began at the time of James. It was under the time of James. And James, when he ruled over Britain for about 22 years, it was a time of peace as well. So there was a lot of expansion there as well as that.
The Confederation of Kilkenny, again, another attempt by the Catholics to
Yes,
group
exactly.
together in some sense.
Well, then you had James, and then you had Charles. So what happened there was then, things calmed down for a while. And then what happened was, in 1641, the Catholics in Ulster rose. And they rose on a guy who was a descendant of the ancient O'Neills, Owen Roe O'Neill. And he fermented a rebellion in Ulster. Now, what was the idea of this rebellion? Independent Ireland. That's what you wanted? Not in your life. That's not what they wanted at all. Very different thinking those days. What they wanted was they would take over Ireland and then they would negotiate from a position of power. They wanted the lands that had been taken from Catholics given back and freedom to practice religion. Did they want independent Ireland? Not on your nanny. Everybody was a royalist. They all still wanted to stay under the English crown. So it's so different. It seems unusual thinking for us today. So what happened was the rebellion got out of control. And I don't know if you've heard about these. There were massacres in Ulster. A famous one that people talk about still is Portadown or Portadean, as they call it up there. Hundreds of the planters who would come in, rounded up, men, women and children, taken to a bridge and thrown into the freezing waters of the river bank. And they were thrown in naked. And if anybody managed to survive, they were met and cut to pieces when they came out. That's still very much in the Protestant consciousness. You'll still see banners about it on the 12th. So there was a lot, the whole thing got out of control. Owen O'Neill didn't intend it, but the whole hatred got out of control. But then in the end, what you had, and you mentioned that, was you had the Confederation of Kilkenny.
Yes.
And now that was interesting. And have you any idea? No one has, of course, I'm sure you haven't, why it was in Kilkenny.
No, I don't.
When O'Neill rose, there were certain areas of the country they didn't capture, and one of them was Dublin. There was also Cork. So that's why the Catholic Parliament was in Kilkenny, and that was made up of the old English who were in Ireland, the Norman planters who are still Catholic, and the old Irish. And they formed a parliament, but they didn't rule Dublin, and they set it up in Kilkenny. And for a while, for about 9 years, they effectively ruled Ireland, with the exception of Dublin, a few areas in the north, and Boyle, the Earl of Cork, as well as that. But the Protestants then in Ireland who were there, the new English who came in, the planters and that, they formed their own armies, and the result was the Confederate Wars.
We have to talk about Mr. Cromwell.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's it. Now, you have the Confederate Wars in Ireland. Now, that's interesting. But what happens there is then, in the meantime, when this rebellion is going on, a war breaks out in England as well. The Civil War.
Yes.
The Civil War between Charles I and the Parliament. Now, Charles and James had ideas about being king, and I don't know if you've heard about this. You know, the divine right of kings.
Sure, of course.
That your authority comes from God alone, and you're not answerable to anybody else. Parliament wanted them to be answerable to the people. So there was a continual tension between the two. James managed to manage it, but Charles wasn't able to manage it. And there was always, as well as that, these kings were Stuarts. They came in from Scotland. They were the lineage of Mary, Queen of Scots, who was a Catholic. And they were always suspected of having Catholic sympathies by the Protestant parliaments, and probably rightly, because every one of them, ultimately, though some are closet Catholics, every one of their wives was a Catholic, even though until the end with James they all said they were Protestants. They were all married to Catholics.
Yeah.
Huge suspicion about that as well. So the whole thing then broke out, and civil war broke out between Parliament, and at that stage Parliament was highly anti-Catholic, highly Puritan, and the Royalists. And now the Confederation of Kilkenny had to decide which way are we going to do.
And John, was the monarchy abolished at that point?
It was, in a kind of a way, by chopping the head off Charles eventually. At the end of the Civil War, he lost the Civil War. So that was the interesting thing. At the end of the Civil War, you had the Royalists in Ireland fighting for the restoration of the king against a parliament who had declared the republic. Wow. It's the opposite way around completely.
And we think we have chaos now.
We have chaos now. And the chaos in Ireland, there were so many people, there were so many atrocities carried out. Do you remember, have you heard about the sack of Cashel?
Well, you were just talking to me about this off air. Yeah. Who was responsible for that?
Well, Morach O'Brien, and this shows the complexity.
Now, what year are we talking about here?
We're
roughly?
Talking about with 1647.
Okay, so mid-century. Yeah.
So
okay.
Morach O'Brien, and he was Morach O'Brien, Morach Agdohan, the burner O'Brien. But he's interesting. Who is he a descendant of? He is a descendant of Brian Boru. But he was born a Protestant. He was supported the king. But then when he saw in 1644 which way the wind was blowing, he thought Parliament was winning, he joined over with Parliament, and he became leader of the parliamentary forces, that the forces who were opposing Prince Charles in Ireland. He led their armies. He went on a campaign against the Confederation of Kilkenny, and he attacked towns, and Cashel was seen as a royalist town, so he attacked Cashel. I'm sure you've heard so much about what happened on the Rock of Cashel when you were growing up. Did you hear it?
I did. I heard bits and pieces of it, but would you sum it up for me? What did happen?
Well, what happened then was, the old idea was, if you went into a church, you got sanctuary. Nobody would attack a church. But now, of course, the Protestants didn't recognise Catholic churches. So all the townspeople fled up, and some of the soldiers fled up there as well. But he attacked the rock anyway, got in over the walls there, began to try and burn them out. They fled into the cathedral, right? But a cathedral isn't easy to defend. If you're ever up there, you know the huge big windows?
I do.
And, they were the downfall of the people who were inside.
Because there was access to it,
through those.
Yeah.
And there was a massacre inside in the cathedral. They say 1,000 people were killed. Now, the soldiers who were defending it were killed, as well as that. The priests who were hiding on the high altar were dragged out and killed, as well as that.
Wow.
As well as that, women, children. When this lust gets going among people, and they were also had been reminded of the massacres 6 years later, in which had taken place for Protestants in Ulster. So they were in a frenzy. Now, not justifying it, I'm just saying this is how things happen in history. And you will always think the town of Cashel took a long time to recover. But the brave burner, what did he do? He suddenly realised things weren't going so well for the Parliament. He went back and joined the Royalists after burning out the Royalists in Cashel. Wow. This is the complications of history. And he went out, and eventually when King Charles II was restored, because he had jumped ship again. He got his lands back down in Clare and lived on to a ripe old age. I mean, that's the sort of thing that happens.
This is the real politic of the day, I guess, is it? The real politic of the day.
Yeah,
Pragmatism, I suppose.
Well, that is the thing. And even the kings, they might have the divine right, but James and Charles were continually looking over their shoulders. And even if they were favourable towards Catholics, they probably couldn't do anything about it because they knew that Parliament was behind them, and they were right. Eventually, they were deposed, and a republic was declared after about 500 or 600 years of having a king in England. There was actually a republic there for about.
So a few years after the sacking of Cashel, then Cromwell arrived with his army, didn't he?
Yeah. And that's an interesting
Tell
thing.
me about that, because there's such hatred for Cromwell here, even still. Even still.
Was he the Hitler of his time? Now, will I tell you something else? Cromwell was a relative moderate. Well, what I mean is, in England, he was relatively moderate. The Stuart kings actually put more people to death. He didn't. Catholicism was illegal, but he didn't chase after the priests. If they did it in private and kept out of the way, there was no big clampdown on them. But for some reason, I don't know what it was, he developed a terrible hatred of Irish Catholics, and particularly Irish priests. Maybe because he heard exaggerated accounts, but he became extremely angry. Something like Tom Barry in the War of Independence. He had an exaggerated hatred for the Essex Regiment above all others, and the same thing seemed to happen here.
And that's why the perception of Cromwell here and the perception of Cromwell in England is totally different.
I was over there lately. There's a big statue outside, and he is seen as having gone a long way to introducing what you call the constitutional monarchy we have now, circumscribing the right of kings and that, and being relatively moderate.
But he was responsible for the execution of, was it Charles? No?
Oh, he was, yes, absolutely.
Charles,
I mean, I suppose, but Charles would have executed plenty of people himself.
Yeah.
I mean, when you lost, that's what happened to you.
You lost the head,
and everyone would have expected that. Now, funnily enough, when his son, Charles II, was restored then after Cromwell died, Cromwell's body was dug up and they hanged him again. They hanged and quartered him even though he was dead. That's the hatred there was among the royalists. But among a lot of people in England, there is still a thing that in the long run, he set up the constitutional monarchy. But in Ireland, I mean, he wasn't it was, I suppose, it was genetic, it was racial cleansing really in Ireland. He came in and he seems to have this hatred. When he captured Drogheda, it wasn't just the soldiers, priests, and he hated priests, but lots of people were killed there as well.
So Drogheda, Wexford and Clonmel, of course.
Yeah, well, Clonmel, but there was no massacre at Clonmel, of course.
He just took over, was it?
Well, he did after a long siege, and lost 2,000 men of the Model Army. Clonmel held out very, very well for quite a long time. That's where Clonmel kind of put an end to his Irish campaign, because he took Drogheda. We don't know what would have happened had he taken Clonmel. He lost a lot of men, and then in the end Clonmel negotiated a surrender at the end. He never took Clonmel in the way he took Wexford and he took Drogheda. And in fact, it was after that then that he returned back to England, sort of, kind of with his tail between his legs after, because Clonmel put a stop to that, as well as that. They held out very heroically. But what I'm saying is the people who remained behind were Cromwellians. They were Cromwellians and they stayed behind. And this hatred of the Catholics continued. And so what happened then was, we get the famous thing then where they felt the Catholics had to be just taken off their land. They were disloyal. And so we get the thing, to hell or to Connacht. And that was the idea. The Catholics would be driven west of the Shannon. And certainly the most successful plantation in Ireland was the Cromwellian plantation. It moved in the end, from about 50% of the land before Cromwell being held by Catholics in Ireland to about 5%. And people were driven off. And then, as well as that, he wanted to exterminate Irish priests only, not English priests, as a class. So they were hunted. And some people mix this up with the penal laws. The penal laws were much later, but priests had a bounty on their head in Cromwell's time. That's when you talk Sean Sagat and that, the famous priest hunters in Ireland. And it was, and a lot of them were brought up to Inishboffin Island, loaded on ships and sent off indentured servants, but basically as slaves to the Caribbean.
And what about the monasteries at that point then?
The monasteries were gone, remember, at that stage.
They were gone.
Yeah. They were slower to go in Ireland. It was Henry VIII who abolished the monasteries. So where he ruled in Ireland, in the east of Ireland, they were abolished straight away. But in places like where the Celtic way or the Gaelic way of life still went on, where O'Neill and O'Donnell were dominant, it wasn't until the early 16th century that the last of the monasteries were abolished. And in fact, mostly they just took their land. But in the end then, some of the monasteries, admittedly, their land had gone. That had been given out as gifts to planters. But the monks still remained on in poverty in the monasteries. In fact, Holy Cross continued until the Confederate Wars and the arrival of Cromwell in Ireland. He hated monks. It wasn't just he wanted their land, he hated them. So they were all driven out of the monasteries, assassinated, or else taken off to the Caribbean.
And John, was it at this time that the monks hid their valuables?
It's hard to say. I would imagine you're talking much earlier. If you're going back to the Derry na Flan or something like that.
That was much earlier, wasn't it?
Much earlier.
Yeah.
So they would have hid their valuables, and we all say, well, it was the Vikings. But the Irish were attacking each other as well and stealing from each other. So everybody wasn't the same. But that's when the monks, that was the glory period then. It was when the Vikings arrived. That was the great flowering of Irish gold. So all these beautiful gold ornaments were here in Ireland, and of course the Vikings saw rich pickings. They were pagans, so they didn't want the altar vessels or anything like that. They wanted to melt them down into gold. But that was very, very much earlier. But then Henry dissolved the monastery. So, for example, the lands at Holy Cross, Kilkenny, were handed over to the butlers, and that was a handy way of keeping them loyal. And the butlers, by and large, not always, but in general, they stayed loyal to the English crown, and they were rewarded for their efforts.
Where are we going to go next time round?
We're going to go next now. We'll go on then from what you call the Restoration. In other words, the end of Cromwell, the Restoration, what happened under Charles, and then, of course, we're leading up to a very interesting period when you have a Catholic king, James II, who declares himself a Catholic, and he is also officially the head of the Protestant Church, and then he has a son that will continue the line. That did not go down well in Puritan circles in England, and we'll see what happened.
It'll be very interesting indeed. And in terms of the rest of Europe, at this point, the 17th century, what else was there? Wars happening everywhere?
Oh, there was a huge sectarian war, the 30 Years' War, and while most of this is going on, of course, you had the Sun King Louis XIV. He was the most powerful king in Europe, and of course, that's where Charles fled to France. When he wanted to escape, because he fled over there. He saw commonality with with a Catholic ruler over there. And then there was continual wars, because what happened is Spain, Italy and France had stayed Catholic, but Germany, largely Holland as well as that, Switzerland, that part of Europe, all went Protestant, and there was a 30 years sectarian war.
O'Neill and O'Donnell, they went to France. Was it France they went to?
O'Neill, yeah, they did. And O'Donnell went first to Spain. He went out first, Hugh O'Donnell, and he died very soon after. So he was trying to bring back an army. Then his nephew, Rory O'Donnell, because he was the guy who went out with the flight of the Earls. They were thinking of going to Spain, but in those days, their storm actually blew them on to France. And in the end, anyway, they ended up down in Rome, and O'Neill died down in Rome in 1616.
John, it's all so fascinating. Thank you for your time today.
The flow of history.
I think it's just wonderful. Thanks, John. That's it from me. Leanne produced, Ali looks after content, and Stephen has the time tunnel on the Lunchtime Show. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye bye.
Tip FM's Tip Today.
With Slattery's Garage, Puck On. Main Peugeot dealers in the Premier County. And now stocking the full range of the luxury French car brand DS Automobiles. Book your test drive today with Slattery's Garage, Puck On. See slatterysgarage.ie.